Reporter Donald McNeil has been a guest here several times since this pandemic began. He was here the very first night we switched to covering this thing full time. Mr. McNeil has covered epidemics and outbreaks across the world for decades. He has done pioneering reporting on coronavirus. When I spoke with him almost a month ago, just as shelter-in-place orders were starting to be enacted across the country, he said on this show, quote, "This is just an attempt to freeze everything in place. Then the real work begins." Would that real work had begun. For instance, Mr. McNeil said at the time that containing the virus would likely require quarantining infected people away from their families. That is a step that we haven't even started to take in this country. But in this latest report, Donald McNeil conveys this warning from epidemiologists. Quote, "If Americans pour back out in force, all will appear quiet for perhaps 3 weeks. Then the emergency rooms will get busy again." Joining us now is Donald McNeil, science and health reporter for the New York Times. Mr. McNeil, I'm happy to have you back with us. Thanks for making time.
Thank you. But, you know,
please.
My report was so gloomy that my editors wanted it made a little more optimistic. And you just read one of the more optimistic paragraphs that was inserted in it. You know, a sort of belief that everything will work out thanks to American ingenuity and scientific advancement. We're in for some tough times, which is kind of the point of that piece.
Well, that comes through. Don't worry, they didn't rosy it up too much. But let me ask you about the distance that you see between where you think we're going and the morbidity and mortality that lays before us, and the kinds of decisions that are being made now to loosen all the restrictions, to open up different types of businesses and places where Americans can congregate. How big a chasm is there between where you think we're going and those kinds of policy decisions?
It's huge. I mean, look, the picture that has been coming out of the White House for a number of weeks is that, don't worry, this will all be over in a couple of months. We'll be able to go back to bars and restaurants. The football stadiums are going to be open in the fall, and life will be back to normal. And I think it's become a little clearer to a lot of people, even people who see that not everything is rosy in Sweden, realizing that, you know, maybe we're going to have to be a little more careful about this. But the truth is, you know, we're not sure how many Americans got infected in the first wave, but the estimates I've seen are between 3 to 10% of the country. In a country of 330 million people, that means about 300 million of us are still vulnerable to the virus. And there's no scenario in which 300 million people can come running out onto the streets and beaches and hopping back onto the subways and going back into our offices and piling into, you know, for the end of the basketball season or the baseball season, and not have this all start over again. And last time you saw it from the White House, we were on the trajectory up to somewhere between 1.6 and 2.2 million deaths. And we haven't lopped off very much of that whole equation and made those people immune. A tiny proportion of the country is immune now. So we'll go back on the same track again if we come out. And that's, people have to realize that this is going to be a slow, careful coming out, and we've got to watch. When Tony Fauci uses the expression, "the virus will tell us," he means if we have broad spread testing all over the country, an enormous number of tests every day, and those tests have to be rapid because you need results. And a study came out of Harvard today saying we're talking about 5 to 10 million tests per day we need in order to really have a good eyeball on the situation in the country. When we get there, we can watch those tests, and when the positives begin to go up, we can say, okay, time to socially distance a little more. Let's back off, not into a total lockdown, but into enough lockdown so that the curves, instead of going up, begin to go down again. It's a set of constantly flattening the curves. And, you know, what it looks like on the epidemiological models is, you know, we're no longer on that giant alpine spike up to 2 million deaths, but instead it's going to be sort of like a series of shark teeth. Some deaths, and then we go back into lockdown and the deaths come down, and then some deaths, and we go back into lockdown and it comes down. And this may continue until we have a vaccine or a prophylactic pill, which may take a while, 18 months minimum.